Okay, tēnā koutou, katoa, ko Karin toko ingoa, ko Canada, Canadian, toko iwi, no kirikiri roa aho, and I've got 10 minutes, so I better get on to it. All right, I sort of had to cut back my agenda a little bit, unlike my speaker before, because I decided to cover too much, but we'll try and make it a little simpler. Okay, so if you go out to our coast, one of the biggest drivers on the coast is wave energy. And wave energy, as you can see from this photo, this is from Tairua Beach in the Coromandel Peninsula. Wave energy is confused. It breaks all over the place. It's unpredictable. And you kind of wonder, well, how can you make anything sensible with this kind of confused environment? So we have a video camera up in Tairua Beach, and we can average that video imagery. And when you average that video imagery, you can see that there are these very distinctive patterns that appear. And those patterns are rip current channels. Oops, okay, we won't do that. Rip current channels and embayments. In fact, if you like patterns, you can start to see patterns everywhere in the coast in the world. From up there in Cape Cod, those welded bars that are about 800 meters apart. In the Sea of Azov, there's these beautiful flying capes that form these patterns. And sort of things in the mid-scale there. And then on Ohiomaka Beach, you can see little beach cusps that are about 30 meters. So you might say, well, what's patterns got to do with anything useful? They're just this esoteric thing. Well, actually, patterns make a tangible difference to people who live on the coast. In Cyclone Gabriel, people got their houses completely covered in silt. But people living quite close by, nothing happened at all. So silt formed these big banks in the river bottom, and those banks were a form of pattern. In the coastal zone, we get areas on the beach that are really strongly eroded, but your mate living down the beach doesn't get eroded at all. Oops. So this is an image from Waikato Regional Council, and it shows the distribution of houses. And that line there, the first line close to the beach, is the 50-meter setback zone. It's the coastal hazard zone. So you can see an awful lot of people in New Zealand live in the coastal hazard zone. And so pattern to them is really important. And in fact, my beach, which is also in the Coromandel, my beach I say because it's the one I like to study, here's a picture of a shoreline one year, the dark line, and the shoreline just the next year. And you can see that it's moved 40 meters on one end, which is about similar to the coastal hazard zone. So the patterns, the give and take between years, is impeding into our hazard zone. Okay, so that brings me to my research. I research how energy transfers in the coastal zone and how that interfaces with morphology. So energy is a wave in the coastal zone, and I like to think of it as a bucket. The size of the bucket is equivalent to the wavelength of the wave, and how much the bucket holds is the energy it can hold. That's the wave height. We study that using pressure sensors that we put out on the beaches, and we use that to make energy spectra. So that's just a graph of energy on one axis and size, the size of the bucket, on the lower axis. And here I show an offshore spectrum, the blue line, and an inshore spectrum in the beach, the red line. So as the wind blows on the coast, it first fills up the smallest buckets, and then nonlinear transfers spill energy over to the next bucket and the next bucket until we generate the waves that we can see in the ocean. In the beach, or out to sea, that big bucket down there doesn't get filled, but on a beach, those get filled as well. And those are those pulsating rip currents and those surge events that we see on the beach. In fact, if we were to do a spectrum right near the shore, these are data from Naranui Beach in Raglan, all the signal of that incident wave that was offshore has completely disappeared, and all that energy is transferred to different scales up and down. Well, that energy then interacts with the morphology. The rip currents push the sand out of the way, and the sand then pushes the rip currents out of the way. So it's a constant feedback. They're constantly playing off each other. We show this when we've put these drifters out to sea. So down there is a drifter, and we put GPSs on the top of those, and they sort of behave a little bit like humans in the surf. We put them out at Naranui Beach, and in the first case, those drifters, we had 9 of them, each line is one of those drifters, circled round and round and round in a rip current system, and then got shot out to sea. Okay, bad luck for the people swimming in that case. In the second case, there was a sandbar offshore, that white thing offshore, and that pushed those drifters back on shore, pushed the rip current back on shore. And that's an example of how the morphology interacts with the currents. So how do we collect evidence of something that is so hard to measure and is so feedback-oriented and so nonlinear? Well, we do that using remote sensing. And this shows an example from my beach in Tyro, now looking as a bird's eye view. That's the wavelength there of those rip currents. That there is how far the sandbar is offshore, and that is the orientation of the beach. And so we can get, over time, over years and years, we can get some quite predictable relationships. And these systems are all related to how much wave height is at your beach, how energetic that system is. And we know approximately why wave height changes, and that is generally to do with the climate cycles. So we know that on the northeast coast of New Zealand, if it's a La Nina year, it's likely to be a big wave year, and we're likely to find these kinds of patterns on that coast. Unfortunately, New Zealand is quite complex, and it's not just the El Niño-La Nina system that's important, it's also all the other different climate indicators that there are about 5 of them around New Zealand. This shows wave height and its correlation with those different climate indicators. And so the reason that all these climate indicators are important is because that coast is connected to the Pacific Ocean. These ones are connected to the Southern Ocean. That system's connected to the Tasman Sea. And this indicator here is one that's particularly associated with activity in the Indian Ocean. So things get formed in the Indian Ocean and they propagate down around south, around Tasmania, and they hit our coast. So we have quite a complex coast that's sitting between all these oceans, all with different drivers. The last thing is, if we rely on statistical modeling, we are basically making all our predictive power dependent on what's happened in the past, all right? So, and now our statistical models have become increasingly complex, increasingly advanced. In fact, we will call them machine learning now. But they're only as good as the data that is used to train them. And unfortunately, with climate change, things are changing around New Zealand. The past is not a good representation of the future. And this shows work that we've done on the wave climate around New Zealand. The left shows the average wave climate, which is increasing by a couple centimeters per decade. This middle one shows the size of extreme events, only the significant ones are plotted. They're increasing as well. And the final plot shows the number of events that occurs in a year, or decade, sorry, and that is also increasing. So everything around New Zealand is changing, and that doesn't include the sediment supply, the orientation of the waves, the river events that are coming out onto the coast. So I think that about sums it up. And the good thing about that is that there'll always be things for me to study for the next 10 years, so that's a good thing. But it's a very challenging coast, and I've really enjoyed working here for the last 10 years. So, oh wait, one more thing. I just wanted to acknowledge my family, my students, all the communities that have let me study their areas, their rohi, and finally my collaborators. Yep, that's it. Now you can talk.
Thank you very much indeed, Karin. Stay at the podium. There's time for
Steve.
Thank you for that talk about all the wonderful things that we should see and often don't see. All we're looking for is good service. Anyhow, one of the things that's always interesting is the interaction between the wave forces and morphology in terms of the rising seas, and that, particularly in some of the areas along the East Coast. Is that something you want to comment on and how that might be changing? Because it often happens in big change events as opposed to rapid events.
So Most of the changes that are going to be a real problem are ones in estuaries, and that's because estuaries are shallow and they're low-lying. And the cases I just showed are mostly open coast cases, so I think our estuaries are particularly vulnerable.
Thinking of the two events, so like in some of those beaches on the East Coast, the beach was carved away in a big storm in 2021, and
Yeah.
now there's very little armament left on those coasts, and they're getting undercut, but the wave, or the beach morphologies and the waves and the breaking of them seem a lot different.
Well, it is. So in a normal situation, the sand gets taken offshore, and it sits offshore and comes back gently onshore. The problem is when you have unusual events, it moves it far too far offshore, and the waves simply can't penetrate that deep to bring it back onshore. So it can take many, many years to come back onshore. So it will be different. I think that's what you're asking. Yeah, it's cumulative events that, yep.
What about the effect of tides? Because I live in an area where a king tide can be 4.5 metres or so. And whereas over in Wellington it's only about a metre rising for the tide. How does that affect what you're seeing on the coastal areas of, say, areas in New Zealand with large tidal rises?
Well, so that's mostly the west coast and up in the, okay. So tides are very predictable, and they're not going to change, but they do, sea level rise on top of a tide is going to make a big difference. Yeah. The geomorphology of tidal systems, we don't generally have big tides in New Zealand. All our east coast is essentially microtidal, but there is, along the UK coast, the tidal currents are very different, and the beach tends to move with tidal currents as well. But they're quite unusual in New Zealand, to be honest. Yeah.
Very interesting, thank you. Do you have any interaction with, say, surf lifesaving in New Zealand in terms of outreach and
Yeah.
sharing information?
Yeah. It wasn't good this summer at all, actually. So yes, those drifter experiments, we use the Coast Guard. They help us collect the drifters and bring them back on shore. And at the moment, we're working with Christo at NIWA, and they're working with Surf Lifesaving New Zealand to develop rip current predictors. Yeah. Yeah, well, ideally, because the problem is you go to the beach and you see that complex breaking pattern, you can't tell where the rips are, especially when you're eye level. So if you could average and get that image where they're all averaged, you could pick the rip currents much more easily. And I think that's where they're trying to make that available. Yeah.
I've got a slightly
Yep.
left field query, Karin, which is a little bit, how does a Canadian end up in a very coastal area in New Zealand? Is that a big plus? Is thinking about
Yeah.
the composition of our academy, which is in part
Yeah.
people who come from elsewhere, but for where New Zealand becomes the place of their scientific research career.
Yeah, well, I'm from Toronto, and actually Toronto has a sandy coast with lots of beaches. You wouldn't think so. They're a bit polluted. People don't swim at them. But they do have a lot of interesting geomorphology. Yeah, but that's not the reason I came to New Zealand.
Okay, well, look, thank you very much indeed, Karin, and we
Okay.
look forward to seeing more of your research over time. Thank you very much.